Researcher Ket Ilvara had read the survival statistics for Anvil Hold 14 times before her transport ever touched down, and every single time, the numbers told her the same impossible thing. According to every environmental model her people had ever built, the moon known to its human inhabitants as Anvil Hold should not have supported a permanent settlement. Its atmosphere carried toxic sulfur compounds in concentrations that required full filtration at all times. Its crust was riddled with thermal vents prone to sudden, unpredictable pressure releases that could vent scalding gas across the surface with less than 4 minutes of warning. Its magnetic field, weak and irregular, left the surface exposed to radiation storms severe enough that a single unprotected exposure could be fatal within the hour. The Thren survey teams who had cataloged this moon 80 years earlier had rated it. Using the standard classification scale every civilized species in this sector relied upon, as Class 9, permanently uninhabitable, not worth the resources required to attempt. And yet, according to the transport's approach scan, Anvil Hold currently supported a human population of just under 3,000 people, had done so continuously for 63 years, and showed every indicator of a settlement that was not merely surviving, but thriving. Ket had spent her entire career studying environmental survivability thresholds. She had never once encountered a dataset that refused to make sense the way this one did. The transport's landing was rougher than she'd expected, buffeted by thermal updrafts that the pilot, a young Thren engineer named Dasin Kaur, navigated with visible tension despite months of preparation. "Atmospheric turbulence is worse than the survey data suggested," he said, hands tight on the controls as the ship shuddered through another pocket of superheated air rising from the surface below. "I'm reading sulfur concentration levels at nearly double what our filtration systems are rated for continuous exposure." "The colony's filtration technology must compensate somehow," Ket said, though even as she said it, she wasn't certain she believed it. "There's no other explanation for how they've sustained a population this size." They touched down on a landing pad that looked, from the air, almost aggressively unremarkable, a flat expanse of reinforced material surrounded by low, sturdy structures that showed clear signs of having weathered decades of harsh conditions without ever being abandoned or significantly damaged. A single figure waited near the pad's edge as the transport settled, wearing a suit that was, Ket noted with some surprise, considerably less bulky and restrictive than the full containment gear her own team had spent the transit preparing to wear. "Researcher Ilvara," the figure said, voice carrying clearly through the suit's external speaker as the transport's ramp lowered. "Welcome to Anvil Hold. I'm Colony Administrator Renata Cole. I understand you're here to study us." "That's correct," Ket said, stepping carefully down the ramp, acutely aware of her own team's full environmental suits, bulky and heavily reinforced, in contrast to Cole's comparatively minimal gear. "I have to say, Administrator, your suit doesn't appear rated for the atmospheric conditions our survey data describes." Cole glanced down at her own suit with something that looked almost like mild surprise, as though the observation hadn't occurred to her before. "It's rated for standard daily conditions. We keep the heavier gear in storage for storm days. You get used to reading the atmosphere out here. Most days, this is plenty." "Most days," Ket repeated carefully. "How many days would you classify as not most days?" "Depends on the season. We're heading into thermal cycle now, so maybe one bad day in 5. Rest of the year, closer to 1 in 12. Cole said this with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss rainfall patterns, and Ket found herself, for the first time in a long professional career built on rigorous, careful data analysis, entirely uncertain how to process what she was hearing. Behind her, she heard Dasin Kaur mutter something under his breath to the rest of the survey team, and turned to find all 4 of her colleagues staring past Cole toward the settlement beyond the landing pad, with expressions ranging from disbelief to open alarm. "Researcher Ilvara," said Senate Vol, the team's senior environmental specialist, keeping her voice low. "I want to note, for the record, that the atmospheric readings I'm getting right now exceed our own suit's continuous exposure rating by a considerable margin, and the administrator is standing there in gear rated for roughly a third of what our instruments say we're currently breathing." "I'm aware, Specialist Vol. I would like it noted that I find this deeply concerning." "Noted," Ket said, though privately she found herself sharing the sentiment, even as some other, quieter part of her mind had already begun cataloging the discrepancy as data rather than danger, the same reflexive shift toward analysis that had carried her through every difficult survey of her career. Let's reserve judgment until we understand the full picture. That's why we're here. Cole, apparently overhearing at least part of the exchange, offered a small, not unkind smile. Don't worry, your instruments aren't malfunctioning. This really is what it looks like out here most days. Come on, I'll walk you through decontamination and get you settled. You'll have plenty of time to run your numbers once you've had a meal and slept somewhere that isn't a transport bunk. The first several days of Ket's survey were devoted to what she'd expected to be a straightforward technical assessment, cataloging the colony's infrastructure, its filtration systems, its emergency protocols, the engineering solutions that must, by any reasonable explanation, account for how 3,000 people continued living on a moon her own species had abandoned as a lost cause 80 years earlier. What she found instead was a colony whose technical infrastructure, while competent, was not dramatically more advanced than what her own survey teams had already assumed would be necessary for any attempt at habitation. The filtration systems were solid but unremarkable. The thermal vent monitoring network was thorough, but built from principles Thren engineering had understood for decades. The radiation shelters, while well-maintained, used shielding technology that offered no significant improvement over what Thren survey teams had already modeled as insufficient for long-term habitation 80 years earlier. The infrastructure, in other words, did not explain the survival statistics. Something else did, and Ket spent her fourth day on the moon trying, with growing frustration, to identify what that something else actually was. She found part of her answer in the colony's central plaza, during what the colonists called, with a casualness that still unsettled her, a storm drill. Thermal event probability climbing to 62% within the next 3 hours, came the announcement over the colony's public address system, delivered in the same flat, unhurried tone Ket had heard used for shift change notifications. All personnel not on essential outdoor duty, please proceed to designated shelter zones at your convenience. At your convenience, Ket watched with a mounting sense of disbelief as the colonists in the plaza responded to what her own training told her was a potentially lethal atmospheric event, with all the urgency of people responding to a mild weather advisory. Children were shepherded toward shelter entrances not by panicked parents but by other children, older ones, moving through what was clearly a well-practiced, almost playful routine. A group of teenagers jogged toward the nearest shelter in what looked distinctly like a race, laughing and shoving each other good-naturedly the entire way. You're allowing your children to treat evacuation drills as a game, Ket said to Administrator Cole, who had joined her at the plaza's edge to observe. They're not drills, Cole said. That's a real thermal event probability. We get maybe 40, 50 of these a year during thermal cycle season. If we treated everyone like a crisis, we'd spend half the year in a state of panic. Kids figured out a long time ago that racing to shelter is more fun than being scared the whole way there. We let them mostly. Keeps the whole thing from feeling like something to dread. But the danger is real. The danger's real, Cole agreed. So is crossing a street back on Earth, statistically. You don't see people panicking every time they step off a curb, even though vehicles kill more people back home every year than thermal events have killed on this moon in 6 decades combined. Danger you understand, danger you've built real systems around managing, stops feeling like danger after a while. It just becomes part of how the day works. Later that same evening, Ket found herself observing what the colonists called storm racing, a recreational activity she initially assumed she'd misunderstood, until she watched it unfold firsthand along the colony's northern perimeter track, where a group of perhaps 30 young adults gathered as the day's second thermal probability window began climbing toward its predicted peak. They're racing toward an active hazard zone, she said to Cole, watching with something close to alarm as the group set off along a marked track that ran parallel to, though carefully outside, a monitored thermal vent field. They're racing along a track our engineers designed specifically for this, Cole corrected. Full sensor coverage, automated shutoff triggers if any reading crosses safety thresholds, medical response staged at 3 points along the route. It looks reckless. It's actually one of the most heavily monitored activities on this entire moon. She nodded toward the track, where the lead runners were already pulling ahead, calling encouragement back to the others. Started as a training exercise decades ago, teaching young colonists to read atmospheric shift patterns at speed. Somewhere along the way it turned into a sport. We didn't discourage it. Turns out people learn faster when they're having fun doing it, and we needed everyone learning this as fast as they could. And if the automated systems fail, if a reading crosses threshold faster than your engineers anticipated, then the shutoff triggers, the race stops, and everyone heads for the nearest shelter marker, which every runner has memorized before they're ever allowed to compete. Cole watched the racers round a distant bend, her expression carrying the particular complicated pride of someone watching a tradition she'd once run herself. Has it failed? Twice in 31 years. Both times, everyone made it to shelter safely, because the whole point of the training is making that response automatic, not something you have to think through while you're scared. Ket said nothing for a long moment, watching the runners disappear around the track's far curve, laughter and shouted taunts carrying faintly across the thin, hazy air, and found herself, not for the last time during her survey, entirely unable to reconcile what her instruments told her about the danger of this place with what her own eyes told her about the evident, unforced joy of the people living in it. Ket found herself returning to that conversation repeatedly over the following weeks, turning it over from every analytical angle she could construct, because it represented, she slowly came to realize, the actual answer to the question that had brought her here in the first place. It wasn't the technology, it wasn't luck. It was something considerably harder to quantify, a cultural and psychological adaptation that her own species' rigid, caution-first survey doctrine had never accounted for, because Thren society had never needed to develop it. She spent an increasing amount of her survey time not in the colony's infrastructure logs, but in its daily life, embedding herself, with Cole's amused permission, in the household of a mining engineer named Terence Akoi and his family, hoping to understand, at a granular level, what daily existence on a Class 9 moon actually felt like from the inside. "You want to understand how we live here," Akoi said, during her first evening in his household, watching with visible interest as she carefully removed her outer suit layers according to the decontamination protocol she'd been taught. "Best thing I can tell you is, stop thinking of it as survival. Start thinking of it as just living somewhere that happens to require more attention than most places do." The distinction seems significant to you. It is. Survival's a mindset for emergencies. You can't run on emergency mindset for 63 years straight. It'll wear you down to nothing. What we've got instead is routine. Everything that would be an emergency somewhere else, we've built a routine around, until it stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like Tuesday. He gestured toward his daughter, a girl of perhaps 10 who was, at that exact moment, calmly checking a handheld atmospheric monitor while doing what appeared to be homework at the kitchen table. "Myra here can read a thermal spike pattern better than half your survey team, I'd bet, and she's not scared doing it, because for her, this has never been anything other than normal." Myra looked up at the mention of her name, glancing curiously at Ket. "Is it true you came from somewhere that doesn't have thermal vents at all?" "My homeworld has some geological activity," Ket said carefully, "nothing at the scale your moon experiences." "That sounds boring," Myra said, with the blunt, unself-conscious honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned to soften her opinions for visiting researchers, and returned her attention to her monitor without further comment, leaving Ket genuinely uncertain, for the first time in the conversation, whether she'd just been insulted or simply informed. The deeper Ket's survey progressed, the more she found herself confronting a truth that unsettled her rigorous, methodical training more than any single piece of environmental data could have. The colonists of Anvil Hold were not fearless. She confirmed this repeatedly, through careful interviews, and eventually, through her own direct observation during an actual severe thermal event in her 6th week on the moon, when a vent release considerably larger than the colony's models had predicted forced an emergency evacuation of the northern residential sector. The alert came without the usual gradual build-up Ket had grown accustomed to, a sudden, sharp klaxon that cut through the colony's ambient noise with none of the earlier drill's unhurried casualness. She was in the Akoi household at the time, and watched, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, the entire family shift from an ordinary evening into a practiced, wordless choreography of preparation, Terence sealing the kitchen's secondary containment hatch while Myra, without needing to be told, gathered emergency supplies from a cabinet clearly stocked and positioned for exactly this purpose. "This isn't a drill probability window," Terence said, checking a wall-mounted monitor with an intensity that had replaced his earlier easy calm entirely, readings climbing faster than the models predicted. "We need to move now." They reached the nearest shelter entrance within 90 seconds, joining a steady, orderly stream of neighbors moving with the same practiced urgency. No panic, no shouting, but an unmistakable seriousness that Ket hadn't witnessed in any of the earlier, more routine drills she'd observed. Administrator Cole's voice came over the public address system moments later, tighter and faster than Ket had ever heard it, coordinating shelter assignments and confirming headcount sector by sector as the vent release, according to the readings visible on the shelter's internal monitor, exceeded even the colony's most pessimistic contingency models. Ket spent the following 90 minutes crammed into a shelter alongside nearly 200 residents, watching them wait out an event that her own instruments confirmed was, by any objective measure, genuinely life-threatening, and found herself studying not the readings, but the faces around her. There was tension. There was, in more than a few cases, visible fear, a young child crying quietly against her mother's shoulder, an elderly man gripping the shelter bench with white-knuckled hands. But there was no panic, no chaos, nothing resembling the breakdown in order that Ket's own species' emergency protocols were explicitly designed to prevent through rigid, top-down control. "You were afraid today," Ket said to Cole, once the evacuation had concluded and the sector had been confirmed safe to reoccupy, finding her in the administrative office looking considerably more drained than the confident figure who had greeted the survey team's arrival weeks earlier. Every time, Cole admitted, sitting heavily in her office chair, the adrenaline of the last several hours visibly draining out of her all at once. "I don't think that ever goes away, not fully. You'd be a fool to stop being afraid of something that can kill you in 4 minutes if you get the timing wrong. The trick isn't not being afraid. The trick is not letting the fear be in charge of what you do next." The event exceeded your predictive models significantly. I noted several readings that surpassed even your stated worst-case contingency thresholds. It happens maybe once every couple years, an event big enough to remind everyone why we take this seriously in the first place. We'll spend the next few weeks reviewing what our models missed, updating the prediction algorithms, running additional drills based on what we learned today. That's part of the routine too. The system only stays reliable if we keep feeding it what actually happens, not just what we expect to happen. How does one learn that distinction? Practice mostly, and deciding pretty early on that you'd rather live somewhere hard and free than somewhere easy and small. Cole studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something, researcher? Your species rated this moon class 980 years ago, permanently uninhabitable. What made your survey teams so certain of that?" "Our environmental models indicated survival probability below acceptable thresholds for permanent settlement," Ket said. "The combination of atmospheric toxicity, thermal instability, and radiation exposure exceeded every safety margin our doctrine requires before authorizing colonization." "And how'd you arrive at those safety margins?" Ket considered the question and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't have a fully satisfying answer. Historical precedent largely. Prior colonization, failures informed increasingly conservative thresholds over successive generations of survey doctrine. That evening, back in the survey team's temporary quarters, Ket found Specialist Vol reviewing the day's data with an expression that had shifted, over 6 weeks, from open alarm into something more complicated. "I've been running the fatality statistics against our own colonization failures on comparable worlds," Vol said, not looking up from her console. "Anvil Hold's incident rate over the last 20 years is lower than 3 of our own successful Class 6 settlements. Lower, researcher. On a world we rated 3 full danger tiers more severe." "What do you make of that?" "I don't know what to make of it. It doesn't fit anything in our doctrine. We don't have a category for a population that treats near-constant lethal risk as ordinary and still manages a lower incident rate than settlements on worlds we consider comfortably survivable." Vol finally looked up, something troubled behind her professional composure. "I keep waiting to find the flaw in their numbers. I haven't found one. I'm starting to think the flaw isn't in their numbers at all. It's in our assumption that caution and safety are always the same thing." "That's a significant admission, Specialist." "It's an uncomfortable one," Vol said. "I didn't come here expecting to question 30 years of survey doctrine. I came here expecting to document a colony that had gotten lucky or was quietly failing in ways their own reports weren't capturing accurately. Instead, I keep finding a community that's simply better at something our own training never taught us to value properly." "So your margins got built by looking backward at what went wrong," Cole said. "Makes sense. Ours got built the same way. Honestly, we just had a lot more failures early on before we figured out what actually worked. First 15 years of this colony, we lost people, more than I like thinking about. We didn't get good at this by being naturally suited to it. We got good at it by being stubborn enough to keep trying after it went wrong, and paying attention every single time it did, until the routine that's kept us alive the last few decades finally took shape." Cole's account of those early years, which Ket spent the better part of a full day documenting in careful detail, painted a picture considerably different from the settled, confident community she'd observed during her first week. The colony's founding generation had arrived with survey data considerably less complete than what Ket's own team now possessed, working from initial atmospheric and geological readings that had, in hindsight, dramatically underestimated the severity and unpredictability of the moon's thermal activity. Year 3, we lost an entire outpost team to event release nobody saw coming, Cole said, pulling up an archived memorial record on her office terminal, a list of names Ket recognized immediately as belonging to the same careful, methodical category of loss her own species' survey doctrine had been built around avoiding entirely. 11 people. My own grandfather's brother was one of them. That's the event that convinced the Colony Council we needed a completely different approach to hazard prediction, not just better instruments, but better habits, faster response, training that didn't depend on people staying calm through pure willpower, because willpower alone hadn't been enough. How did the colony respond? Rebuilt the entire warning system from scratch. Brought in geologists who'd study nothing but this moon's specific vent behavior for the rest of their careers. Started running drills, real ones, not just theoretical exercises, until the response became something people's bodies knew how to do without their minds having to fight through panic first. Took another decade before the fatality rate dropped to something we could live with. Another decade after that before it dropped to what you're seeing now. Cole closed the memorial record with obvious care. People back home sometimes ask me why we didn't just give up after year 3, after losing 11 people to a mistake that should never have happened. Truth is, we came close. There was a serious vote, not long after, about whether to formally request evacuation and abandon the colony entirely. What changed the outcome? My grandmother stood up at that council meeting and said something I've never forgotten, even though I wasn't born yet to hear it firsthand. She said giving up wouldn't bring back the 11 people we'd lost. It would just mean they died for nothing, instead of dying for something we were still willing to finish building. The vote to stay passed by 4 votes. 4 people, out of the entire colony council, decided that was worth staying for. Cole looked up at Ket, something quietly fierce behind her tired expression. I think about that margin sometimes. 4 votes, 60 years ago, is the reason any of this exists for you to study at all. The conversation stayed with Ket long after that evening, threading through the remainder of her survey in ways she hadn't anticipated when she'd first arrived, expecting a technical assessment and finding, instead, something considerably more complicated to categorize. She spent time with the colony's emergency response teams, watching young volunteers, barely out of adolescence, trained for thermal vent response scenarios with the same unhurried methodical competence she'd observed in the plaza during her first week. She interviewed elderly residents who had survived the colony's difficult early years, listening to accounts of losses that had clearly shaped, through hard, painful experience, every protocol and habit the colony now treated as unremarkable routine. She watched Myra Akoy and her friends play what was, unmistakably, a game built entirely around correctly identifying atmospheric hazard patterns, competing good-naturedly to see who could spot a developing thermal signature fastest. You're teaching survival skills through play, she observed to Terence Akoy during one of her final evenings in his household. Best way to teach anything to a kid, he said, doesn't feel like a burden if it feels like a game. By the time they're old enough to understand how dangerous this place actually is, they've already got the instincts built in from years of playing at it. Doesn't mean they're not scared sometimes. Means the fear doesn't get to be the only thing they know how to feel about living here. He was quiet for a moment, watching Myra and 2 of her friends compare notes on their handheld monitors, laughing over some detail of the afternoon's hazard identification game. You know, my own father used to say something about this place that I didn't understand until I had kids of my own. He said Anvil Hold doesn't ask you to stop being afraid. It just asks you to get good enough at what you do that fear stops being the loudest thing in the room. Took me a long time to understand that's not the same as bravery, not exactly. It's closer to craft. You practice a skill long enough, carefully enough, and eventually your hands know what to do even when your mind's still catching up to how frightened it ought to be. That's a remarkably precise way of describing an adaptive psychological mechanism for someone without formal training in the subject. Akoy laughed, a warm, genuine sound. We've had 63 years to think about it, researcher. Man starts noticing patterns after that long, formal training or not. Ket's final survey report, compiled over the following weeks aboard the transport home, ran considerably longer than her supervising committee had originally requested, because she found, in the process of writing it, that she could not adequately explain Anvil Hold's survival statistics using the standard environmental and technical frameworks her doctrine relied upon. The colony's technology was solid, but unremarkable. Its infrastructure investment was significant, but not dramatically beyond what Thren's survey teams had already modeled as necessary and insufficient. What made the difference, she wrote, in a section of the report she suspected would generate considerable debate among her more traditionally minded colleagues, was something her species' survey doctrine had never adequately accounted for: the capacity to transform sustained, genuine danger into practiced, internalized routine, without allowing that routine to become complacency, and without allowing the fear that danger reasonably produced to become paralysis. Ket returned to Anvil Hold 18 months later, this time as the lead of a formal follow-up study rather than an initial survey, and found the colony largely unchanged in the ways that mattered, still navigating its Class 9 environment with the same unhurried, hard-won competence she remembered, though she noted, with some private satisfaction, that Myra Akoi had grown half a head taller and had, according to her proud father, recently placed first in the colony's annual thermal hazard identification competition, a tradition Ket learned had existed for over 30 years and produced, among its many practical benefits, a startlingly high number of the colony's most skilled emergency responders. She found Administrator Cole in the same office, reviewing the same kind of routine reports, and greeted her with something that had shifted, over 18 months of reflection, from professional curiosity into genuine respect. "Your report caused quite a stir back home," Ket admitted, settling into the chair across from Cole's desk. "Several of my colleagues have proposed reclassifying the Class 9 designation entirely, suggesting it measures technical survivability rather than accounting for what you might call adaptive capacity." "Been telling people something like that for 63 years, Cole said, with the dry humor Ket had come to recognize as characteristic of the entire colony. Nice to hear somebody with a formal classification system finally caught up. "I confess, Administrator, I still find myself struggling to fully explain it, even now. The data supports the outcome. I understand intellectually the mechanisms you've described to me, the routine, the practiced fear management, the generational transfer of skill through what amounts to structured play. And yet something about it remains, to my own analytical framework, genuinely difficult to categorize." Cole considered that for a moment, a small knowing smile crossing her face. "You know what my grandmother used to say, back when I was young enough to still be scared of storm days. She said humans have always been good at exactly one thing, more than any other species she'd ever read about. We're good at deciding a place is home, and then doing whatever it takes to make that decision true, even when everything about the place says we shouldn't be there at all." "That's not a particularly scientific explanation, Administrator." "No," Cole agreed, "it's not, but you've been trying to fit us into a scientific explanation for 18 months now, researcher Ilvara, and I notice you keep coming back anyway. Maybe the honest answer is just that some things are true whether or not they fit neatly into a classification system." Ket didn't have an immediate response to that, and found, sitting in the quiet of Cole's office with the muffled sound of colony life continuing outside, that she wasn't entirely sure she wanted one. She had come to Anvil Hold 18 months earlier, seeking a technical explanation for an impossible survival statistic, and had found instead something considerably harder to reduce to data: a community that had simply decided, generations ago, that a moon rated permanently uninhabitable was worth the sustained, unglamorous, decades-long effort of proving that rating wrong. Before she left the colony that final time, she made a point of visiting the Akoi household once more, finding Myra, now taller and more self-assured, helping coordinate a training session for a group of younger children learning the basics of hazard pattern recognition. "You came back," Myra said, when she noticed Ket watching from the edge of the training yard. "I did. I wanted to see how the colony had changed in the time since my first survey." "Has it changed, I mean?" Ket considered the question honestly, less than I expected, which I've come to understand is, in its own way, a form of remarkable success. Places that survive by accident tend to change unpredictably. Places that survive by design tend to simply keep doing what already works, refining it slowly rather than reinventing it out of necessity. Myra seemed to turn that over for a moment, then gestured toward the children practicing their hazard readings nearby. "I used to think it was strange, you coming all this way just to watch us do ordinary things. My dad explained it to me once. He said, where you're from, this isn't ordinary at all." "It is not," Ket admitted. "I don't think it ever will be for my own people. But I've come to believe that isn't a failure of your colony to explain itself properly. I think it's simply evidence of something genuinely rare that took your people generations of hard, deliberate work to build, and that no visiting researcher, however thorough, should expect to fully understand after a single survey or even two. Myra smiled, the same blunt, unself-conscious honesty Ket remembered from their first meeting years earlier. Sounds like you finally get it. I believe I finally do, Ket said. Her second and final report on Anvil Hold, filed formally with the Thren Survey Authority the following year, concluded with a passage that departed considerably from the clinical, data-driven language of standard survey documentation, a departure her supervising committee questioned but ultimately allowed to remain, given the unprecedented nature of the findings it summarized. The colony at Anvil Hold does not survive its environment through technology superior to what our own doctrine considers necessary for habitation. It survives through a sustained, generational transformation of danger into routine, achieved not by eliminating fear, but by refusing to let fear determine what its people are willing to attempt. This distinction, difficult as it may be to formally quantify, appears to represent a genuine adaptive capacity our current survey classifications do not adequately measure, and I recommend, in the strongest terms available to me, that future habitability assessments account for it. The Class 9 designation for Anvil Hold's specific environmental profile was formally revised within 2 years of that report's filing, not to a lower danger classification, since the moon's underlying hazards remained exactly as severe as they had always been, but to a new category the Thren Survey Authority created specifically in response to Ket's findings. Class 9 Adaptive Viable, a designation that acknowledged, for the first time in Thren colonization doctrine, that survivability was not solely a function of environmental hazard, but also of the sustained, deliberate will of the people willing to call a dangerous place home. Myra Akoi, by the time she reached adulthood, had become one of Anvil Hold's most respected emergency response coordinators, training new generations of colonists in the same practiced, unhurried competence her father had once described to a visiting researcher as simply the way the day worked. When asked, years later, by a documentary team curious about the colony's origins, why she'd chosen to stay on a moon that most of the galaxy still considered barely survivable, she gave an answer that echoed, without her ever having heard it directly, the words Administrator Cole had once offered a skeptical Thren researcher in a quiet office overlooking a thriving, storm-scarred plaza. "This is home," she said simply. "We didn't wait for it to become safe before we decided that. We just decided, and then spent every day since proving it was worth deciding."